Welcome back for another execution method video. Like these videos tend to do, we will be taking some dark and bizarre turns. This method is both ancient and modern, and its creation and use has demonstrated the extreme opposite ends of the spectrum of humanity. I am talking about none other than the dreaded guillotine. This death device has fascinated the masses for several centuries, and it has a rap sheet miles long. We are going to be discussing what it does, how it might feel, while also diving down a few unexpected rabbit holes. My content contains graphic depictions of death that some may find upsetting. Viewer discretion advised. The guillotine sure looks intimidating. It stands pretty tall at about 15 feet, with a sharp angled blade suspended at the top. Below it lies a bench, with what looks like a stockade where a person's head is secured. The objective is simple. The blade falls quickly, creating enough force to cleanly penetrate through the neck, resulting in a decapitation. At the time of its creation, it was believed that the moment that the head was separated from the body was the moment that death occurred. That is why this brainchild was believed to be a more humane replacement for axe beheadings, executions by sword, and the gallows. In 1789, Joseph Guillotine proposed the first idea of a mechanized beheading device in France, and people immediately got to work. By 1791, the first prototype was built. Just 1 year later, the first ever execution by guillotine was put on the books. In 18th century France, executions were open to the public, and townsfolk looked at them as an entertaining excursion. They were the last people to call for a more humane method. The masses preferred something that took a bit of time and had a lot of literal blood, sweat, and tears. Still, they were initially pleased with the spectacle of witnessing a brand new death device. On a mild April afternoon in 1792, people gathered in droves outside of the Hotel de Ville. The turnout was much larger than a typical execution and demanded the response of National Guardsmen to maintain order. Their entertainment was to be the death of Nicholas Pelletier, a man convicted of robbery, assault, and possibly even murder. Nicholas was marched out in front of the cheering crowd sporting a red shirt which happened to match the color of the guillotine. There was very little pomp and circumstance. He was beckoned to lay his head down where it was secured, and within seconds, a gravelly roar erupted as the blade began sliding down. There was no time for bystanders to blink or look away. In under a minute's time, the man had been secured in place and cleanly beheaded. This made the execution a success in the creator's eyes, but the crowd was not happy. They had all been talking about this event for days with anticipation. They dressed up and planned to attend a show. They were used to watching messy beheadings using swords and axes where another person doles out the punishment. On occasion, one swing of an axe didn't get the job done and it required a second or even third. They also often witnessed hangings on the gallows where the neck was not always broken at the drop. Sometimes the condemned struggled and writhed for minutes before asphyxiation took them out. This device was just too fast, precise, and even clinical for their liking. The crowd began collectively chanting, "Bring back our wooden gallows." In spite of the crowd's displeasure, the guillotine was a keeper. It was meant to become the sole execution method for all, regardless of class. That is what happened, but it also went on to become the very symbol of the bloody French Revolution. Just a year after the first guillotine execution, the period known as the Reign of Terror would kick off, where mass arrests led to mass executions without any due process. An estimated 17,000 people were beheaded in under a year's time, and the actual number could be much larger. The guillotine outlasted the French Revolution and its dark history. It wouldn't ride off into a sunsetting retirement until the 20th century. The very last execution by guillotine in France took place in 1977. Some of you may have been alive at that point. In the very least, your parents or grandparents were. The guillotine was not replaced by a new method because France abolished capital punishment in 1981. There were no executions that took place in those few years in between. This device did make its way to other regions and countries, typically with a smaller shelf life. It was used in Nazi Germany, Greece, and even Switzerland. On paper, the guillotine appears to have a high success rate, with the possibility of even a 0% rate of it going wrong. However, it was most robustly used during a time when such things were not recorded. I have no doubt that when maintained appropriately, this device gets the job done, but there is room for error. We all know that when humans are in charge, errors are likely to occur, and 2 centuries of use leaves a lot of opportunity for that. So, what could have gone wrong? Well, any chef will tell you the importance of keeping their kitchen blades sharp. When a blade is used to cut, it creates friction with the object it is cutting, which results in gradual wear and tear. The same is true of the guillotine blade. Every time that it slices through flesh, muscle, and bone, it is causing friction. This makes sharpening the blade an important factor in maintaining the effectiveness of the device. During a period where 17,000 people were executed in 11 months, this device's blade was working overtime. Even though there were likely multiple devices, each one was being battered and abused. This would amount to over 1,500 executions each month and nearly 52 per day. I simply cannot believe that not one of those was carried out using a dull blade. If the blade was too dull, it simply would not be able to cleanly sever the head. It still has a high likelihood of causing death. However, it could change the cause to a fractured cervical spine and eventual asphyxiation. Instead of resulting in a sharp force injury, it could result in blunt force trauma, or more likely, a combination of both. The forces at work would be enough to penetrate skin and muscle, but possibly not bone. The guillotines of that time applied an average of 5,000 to 6,000 pounds of pressure, which is more than enough for a cervical fracture. With a dull blade, think of it more as smashing rather than slicing. This would also cause compression of the airways, cutting off the ability to breathe. This could go from a relatively swift death to a longer, much more agonizing one. There are anecdotal stories of executioners intentionally using a dulled blade for people who they wanted to see suffer. It is not confirmed by historical record, but it's also not ruled out. Another potential mishap would be the blade getting stuck. We have another anecdotal testimony of just this happening. The story is said to have occurred in the infancy of this device. Just like anything, whether it's a product, machine, or system, amendments must be made over time. Trial and error, if you will. The early models of the guillotine allegedly used a straight-edged blade, as opposed to an angled one. One very unfortunate prisoner was inadvertently used to demonstrate the error portion of trial. He was secured below the blade and it was released. Bystanders braced for his head to roll into the receptacle designed to catch it, but the basket remained empty. They heard the rumble of the blade falling, but it appeared that something prevented it from completing its job. The blade certainly made a deep gash, but it was stuck, the bottom buried inside of the prisoner's neck, and the prisoner appeared to still be alive. The executioner walked up, pulled the blade out of his tissue, and reset. Once again, the rumble of the blade falling echoed over the crowd, yet the head-catching basket remained empty. The blade was once again stuck inside of the prisoner's neck, penetrating slightly deeper this time. For a second time, the blade was retrieved from his tissue, and for a second time, the prisoner appeared to still be alive. This was especially apparent from the amount of blood still oozing from his wound. The blade was reset, the rumble was heard, and finally, the prisoner's head, with his badly butchered upper neck, fell into the basket. What was to blame, you wonder? There is a big difference between a straight-edged blade and an angled one. With a straight long edge, you have to chop in one motion. The force is dispersed along the edge. To get this job done, you need more force. With an angled blade, the neck is sliced and the force more concentrated. This rectangular blade met too much resistance in the tough bone and just couldn't get all the way through in one chop. We don't know how accurate this witness story is or how much dramatic flair has been added over the centuries, but it does make sense. The original guillotine design did in fact utilize a straight-edged blade, and physics tells us that such a blade would have to rely solely on downward force. In the modern era, we could make this work more effectively using hydraulics, applying more pressure, but in those days, handmade machines were much simpler. The cervical spine would likely prove to be resistant to the forces at work. During the Reign of Terror, I can't imagine that executioners cared how humane a method was. There was little, if any, mercy offered. The main weapon of choice was instilling fear, and a badly botched execution would do the trick. It is a stark contrast to know that the guillotine was created to carry out a more suffer-free end, only for it to become a mass weapon of terror. This begs the question that if everything does go right, is the guillotine really an instant, suffer-free death? There are aspects of a death to take into consideration to determine the level of suffering other than just physical pain. These are things like mental anguish and panic, things that would firmly be placed in the trauma category. If you think about moments in your life where you found yourself gasping for air or unable to breathe, like perhaps during an asthma attack or when you became disoriented while underwater, you would likely not classify the immediate sensation as true physical pain. You still remember it vividly and know that you never want to experience it again. Those moments were filled with a kind of desperate panic that is emotionally scarring. Or think about the most painful event that you've experienced in your entire life. Did it happen suddenly with zero time to react or ruminate, or did you see it coming before it happened? When people are involved in motor vehicle accidents or aircraft disasters, they tend to talk most about the moments right before. Those moments are often filled with feelings of terror and helplessness, which can be just as traumatic as the moment of impact or what precedes it, just in a different way. You might be wondering why I'm bringing this up when discussing a death that is as quick and cut and dry as beheading. Decapitation is simply not compatible with life. This is true, but with advancements in science and studies, we have learned that a lot of deaths that we once thought of as instant just aren't. We learned this in my video about firing squad. One prisoner's bravery led to a study that proved a gunshot to the heart is not an instant death. When it comes to the guillotine, there have been many rumors of the head still showing signs of life after they were removed from the body. For years, many explain these away as scary campfire stories and urban legend. Still, this idea fascinated many minds and led to some studies and even grotesque experiments. Though many of these give distinct mad scientist vibes, some of these studies were far more controlled and professional in manner. The results have led to even more terrifying questions. In 1905, Dr. Gabriel Aru swore that he had an intelligent communication with a deceased prisoner, or the prisoner's head rather. After the prisoner was beheaded by the guillotine, he called out his name and watched as his eyes slowly lifted to meet his. This action interrupted a deeply anguished expression furrowed in his brows and painted on his face. The doctor said that the motion was smooth, even, and conscious. He likened it to a person being interrupted out of their own deep thoughts. Another man executed during the French Revolution told a trusted individual that if he remained conscious after beheading, he would continue to blink until he couldn't anymore. The blade rumbled, his head landed in the basket, and he allegedly blinked several times for several seconds. Executioners saw enough evidence of life after execution that they began conducting their own bizarre experiments on the heads of prisoners. In 1793, an assistant executioner held up the head of his most recent victim and firmly slapped it across the cheek. The crowd and executioner claimed to see an angry expression emerge as the skin flushed brightly. This became a trend, and soon executioners were exposing the decapitated heads to candle flames and chemicals in hopes of soliciting an obvious response, with many claiming that they did just that. In 1880, a doctor attempted to pump blood into a head in hopes of bringing it back to life. He really believed that the head would just spring back and start speaking to the crowd. I think we all know that that did not end up happening. A head does not possess the anatomy alone needed to talk. The fascination of this phenomenon has continued into the 21st century, and some legitimate studies with promising results have emerged. Some of these studies were done to understand brain activity post-mortem, and some specifically involving decapitation. For instance, a study on lab rats showed conscious activity for an average of 4 seconds after beheading. Numerous studies on human brains have shown complex brain function following death. The evidence thus far is enough to get most experts to agree that beheading is not a truly instant death. Some still debate how long consciousness continues, but it's clearly only a matter of seconds. In my humble opinion, I would put the time frame between 5 and 9 seconds. Brain activity would continue for longer, but not with use of executive function. Immediately upon the severing of the neck, there would be a catastrophic drop in blood pressure. Whatever blood supply the brain has at that moment is the last that it will ever receive. I imagine that it would be a similar time frame to an anoxic brain injury, just sped up a bit. In anoxic brain injury, the brain is cut off from oxygen, inducing loss of consciousness in around 10 to 15 seconds. With beheading, there are other factors at play that could cut that time up to in half. Up to 9 seconds seems like such a short period to us now, but when in serious distress, it can feel like much longer. In a moment, I'm going to pause for 9 seconds. Try to think as many thoughts as you can during that period, starting right now. This should put into perspective just how long a head may remain conscious post-beheading. If you were about to have a date with a guillotine, not only would you have days, weeks, or even months to obsessively ruminate on the idea of it, you would also have to undergo certain preparations. If your hair is longer, it would have to be chopped in order to prevent the blade from becoming caught in it. This preparation became common practice after a man facing beheading by sword ended up with his jaw severed instead. The sword blade became stuck in his hair, leading to a much worse end. During the French Revolution, public humiliation was often used prior to the guillotine. This meant that women were often shaved completely, and prisoners were forced to carry signs and dramatically beg for forgiveness. Once these rituals conclude, you would be forced to lie down on the guillotine bench, face down. Some devices had a bench that began upright. Your throat would be positioned over a curved stockade base, with a curved top placed over the back of your neck. It would be snug, leaving you little to no room to wiggle or move. The soundtrack of your death would be a rowdy, cheering crowd and 3, 2, 1. For just a few brief moments, you would feel the vibrations of the blade falling reverberate through your head and neck, followed by one swift burst of force. This would likely be felt in sensations of heat and electricity, coupled with the feeling that you've been whacked insanely hard with a hammer. Oftentimes, when people are stabbed or sliced, they feel the generated heat, but the friction burn and electrical bursts come a tad later. Many initially believe that they were actually punched really hard right after. That is because we will always feel and experience the brute force, but surging catecholamines, shock, and the delay in perception of pain protects us from the sensations resulting from the damage. This protection can last anywhere from a few blinks to a few seconds. That is when a crescendoing chorus of blight burning, electrical bursts, and hot pressure will rise up within your wounds and surrounding area. Sometimes this chorus begins like a whisper, and other times more like a scream. It will always grow and grow in strength. If you maintain consciousness for only 5 seconds, you might only experience a small fraction of this. If it's closer to 9, those sensations will have enough time to taunt your consciousness into perceiving the entirety of the horror. That is, if you still experience sensations at all. We really don't have enough information to surmise if the severing of the head cuts off the ability to feel entirely. In the lab rat study, brain activity experienced a burst immediately after, which researchers took as reaction to painful stimuli. That makes sense to us now, but we simply just don't know everything about the brain in rats or in humans. Even if you can no longer experience all of the unfortunate sensations brought on by the blade slicing through your neck, still maintaining conscious thought is enough to make this traumatic. I mean, just imagine that 1 second you are lying down whole, and the next, you are rolling into a basket, possibly catching a glimpse of your headless body in the process. That is nightmare fuel. Regardless, I still deem this as slightly more humane than beheading by sword, but not by much.